Chapter 14. What You Use It For. The prince yelled in surprise, but the cry was cut short when the sword pressed deeper into the skin of his neck. "None of that now, little exile." The defender breathed into his face, smelling of garlic and rancid meat, a combination so disgusting that the prince almost emptied his stomach. But he swallowed and held back, and was able to steal frantic glances to his right and left in an effort to locate Leah and Tamaz. Their bedrolls were empty. There was no sign of where they'd gone. He tried to understand what was happening, but the pieces didn't seem to fit together. How had this happened? It was just past dawn, and the shadows of the forest still lay long and cool across the campsite. The fire was still banked, and their bags were stashed where they'd left them for the night. There didn't appear to be any sign of a disturbance. "Don't worry, your friend is here too." The defender grabbed a hank of his hair and, careful to keep the sword close, pulled him upright. The prince was able to turn further around, and finally he caught sight of Tamaz. His heart lurched and skipped a beat before beginning to pound more intensely. The big man was sitting calmly on the ground, though he was neither tied nor bound, and no sword or dagger threatened him. Instead, a man dressed all in black, head shaved and arcane symbols tattooed into his skin, stood over him, holding a blood-red crystal into which Tamaz was staring helplessly. A soul catcher. A blood mage. "No!" the prince cried, suddenly heedless of the blade at his throat. The blood mage threw up a hand, and immediately 3 defenders closed in on the prince, all equally unwashed and dressed in the notorious red and brown uniform, with insignias of the Trilogy on their chests. They held him down, despite his thrashing. "Came on you in the night," said one of the defenders. "Schulman there, our blood mage, he sensed you a ways off and said we'd wait for dawn. And then he'd come and hypnotize the guard and we'd have the other 2 of you no problem. Happened just like he said." "Quiet," said a voice, and the prince knew it was the blood mage, for the voice had the raspy quality of all that cursed fellowship. "Sorry, Schulman," the defender said, with obsequious deference. The prince was thinking hard and fast. What could he do? "Is the girl secured?" the blood mage asked. "Yes, sir," the defender, holding the sword to the prince's throat, responded. "On her way to Formeau. Captain Touraine is seeing to it himself." Confusion and panic fought inside the prince. Why had they taken Leah? Had the orders about him changed? Was he to be killed here by the blood mage, and his soul harvested to feed the mage's power? But no, that made no sense. If they wanted to kill him, why would they take Leah? And then it came together, the pieces falling into place with almost audible clicks. They didn't know who he was. They had no idea who they were holding. They had stumbled on the 3 of them and decided they only needed one of them for questioning, and that the other 2 could be sacrificed. His mind expanded, taking in every detail of their appearance. All had several weeks' worth of beard growth on their cheeks, and all smelled so foul that it was clear they hadn't bathed in at least that long. The blood mage, from what the prince could see, looked gaunt, almost as if he were starving, which meant that he had gone some time, perhaps weeks, without metaphysical sustenance. The defenders all had caked layers of mud and grime on their boots and halfway up their thighs. Several also had large, angry boils on their necks and cheeks. Bug bites? They've been in the swamps east of Lake Chartaine, he realized. They must have been looking for exiles like Leah and Tamaz who used that way to get around the usual patrols. Tamaz gave a small groan, and the prince realized that he needed to do something, anything, to break the blood mage's trance. If he didn't, the big man would soon be beyond saving. But what could he do? He couldn't move. The defender with the sword was staring very intently at his neck to discourage any such thoughts. Leah wasn't anywhere around. As the thought crossed his mind, he heard, almost at the edge of hearing, the sharp whistling sound that signaled one of the girl's daggers flying through the air. The defenders heard it as well, and they all turned to look into the forest, but they were too late. The long, wicked length of steel flew through the clearing and pierced the blood mage in the back, where his heart would be. The black-robed man gave a small cry and fell to the ground. For a long moment, no one moved. Not the defenders, not the prince, not Tamaz as he came out of his trance. All of them simply stared, uncomprehending, at the fallen figure of Schulman the blood mage. And then, all 7 hells broke loose. The prince threw himself backward, away from the sword at his neck, as the defender holding it drew back the deadly metal and sliced it clean through where his head had been. The prince struck out both with hands and feet, whipping around in a circular motion. He connected with 2 pairs of ankles and swept both men to the ground. The remaining men, 3 all told still standing, drew their swords and stabbed at him. An enormous figure came up behind them, casting a shadow over them as it blocked out the rising sun, and they turned to find a thoroughly enraged giant staring down at them. Seizing his chance, the prince reached into his belt and pulled out the dagger Leah had given him. He flipped over, rolled into a crouch, and slammed the dagger's hilt into the temples of the men he'd knocked to the ground. They stopped trying to regain their feet and went limp. 3 muffled cries, followed by 3 heavy thumps, signaled that Tomas had dealt with the other defenders in similar fashion. The prince spun to his feet, surveying the scene, pulse pounding in his ears. The blood mage still lay on the ground, unconscious, but, as the prince knew, not yet dead. He hurried over and grabbed the blood-red crystal that had been used to hypnotize Tomas, breaking the leather cord that held it strung around the mage's neck. He threw it on a nearby rock and scrabbled around for another. His hand closed over one, and he pulled, prying it from the earth as the blood mage began to stir. He raised the second rock high in the air and brought it crashing down on the soul catcher. As rock met crystal, there was a terrifying moment where it felt as though the rock would be repulsed and the crystal would remain whole, but then came the sound of breaking glass, a sharp shattering as if a piece of reality had been fractured, and the crystal broke. The blood mage screamed, so loudly that the prince flinched away, his ears ringing. The black-robed figure rose like a corpse marionette on tangled strings, twitched in the direction of the prince, and then fell to the floor and moved no more. The prince whirled back and saw that Tomas had thrown all of the defenders into a line against 2 adjacent oak trunks and was binding them with lengths of their own red and brown uniforms. "How did they find us?" the giant asked. "What happened?" "They must have been scouting the swamps for exiles. Their clothes, their hair, they're filthy. You see those bug bites? From what that one said, they were returning to the roads when the blood mage sensed us, and they set an ambush for us as we slept." "Why didn't you sense them?" he asked, looking at the prince with an unnerving intensity. I haven't been using the talisman," he said. If he had listened to the girl and continued using it, he could have prevented this. But he let his pride and anger blind him. "How did they take me? The blood mage?" "Yes," the prince said. "He hypnotized you, tried to feed off of you." "How did you break the trance?" "I didn't. Leah did." "What? Where is she?" "I don't know. They said they were taking her north to Formeaux, but that she must have escaped and come back." "Is that her dagger?" "Yes, it's how she broke the trance. She threw it and struck the blood mage." Tomas was suddenly in the prince's face. "From where? Did you see her throw it?" No, it came flying from the forest, but she can't be far." "She's a spellblade, princeling," Tomas hissed at him. His anger and fear was palpable and barely controlled. "She can throw a dagger from wherever she wants and make it go wherever she wants. She could be a mile away. She threw the dagger hoping the blood mage would be where he was when she last saw him, and she got lucky. But she only would have thrown it as a last resort, only would have thrown it if she knew there was no way she could use it to help her own situation and come back to us." The prince looked into the giant's face and saw that Leah was lost to them. No, you're wrong. She can't be that far." "Far enough that you'll never catch her." Both the prince and Tomas whipped around and saw that one of the defenders had regained consciousness. There was blood dripping down his face, and it made him look like a grisly, reanimated corpse. He was smiling at them with an expression of zealous triumph. "Explain yourself," Tomas said, towering over him and radiating danger. "She's on her way to Formeaux with a squad of 24 fully armed defenders of the realm. They left almost an hour ago before you or this scrawny little runt even woke up." "Liar," the prince said. "I speak the truth," he said, grinning his bloody grin. "We have to go after her," the prince said to Tomas. "How?" the defender asked, laughing. "We slaughtered your horses. You should have been more careful in setting up your campfire. We could see it through the trees a mile away. Didn't even need the blood mage to point us in the right direction at that point." "I told her," the prince said, suddenly angry at the exiles, trying to make it their fault for some reason he didn't understand. "I told you both we needed to be more careful." "Too late for that now," Tomas growled, anger and pain in his eyes, and the prince realized, with despair, that the big man had a point. It didn't matter now who was in the wrong. Leah was gone, and they had no way to get her back. If he had continued to use the talisman, like she'd suggested, to feel around him for signs of life and pursuit. "They will reach Formeaux before you can come within 12 miles of them," the defender said, breaking into the prince's thoughts. "And once she's there, she's out of your reach, and we will have a bargaining chip the exiled kindred dare not ignore." "What is she to you? Why didn't you take me instead?" the prince demanded, grabbing the man by the throat. He squeezed too tightly, but he couldn't help it. Impotent energy was racing through him that he had no other way to express.
"The daughter of General Goldwyn, the leader of the armies of the exiled kindred,"
the defender managed to choke out.
"And not only that, but part of a rogue pair, and likely a spellblade. She's worth 10 of you."
The prince shot a look at Tomaz. The look of horror on the big man's face was all the confirmation he needed. "How do you know all that?" the exile asked, pushing the prince out of the way and grabbing the man himself, lifting him clear off the ground into the air as far as the restraints would allow. The prince had never seen Tomaz lose his temper, even when he was fighting for his life, but there was a panic beneath his anger now, and his massive shoulders were shaking. He was on the verge of losing control.
"We know more than you could ever guess, Exile."
The way the man spat the final word struck a chord in the giant, and he dropped the defender, drew his sword, and held it against the man's neck. The defender stared back at him defiantly, and it was clear that he was ready to die. Tomaz raised his sword, held it high, and then let out a bellow of frustration. He turned away and threw Malachi end over end into a nearby tree, where it sank up to the hilt and caused the tree to sway dangerously. "Tomaz," the prince said. His mind helplessly began imagining what kind of treatment Leah would undergo if she made it to Formeau, into the hands of his brother Tiffanel. The thought of seeing her at the mercy of the Prince of Foxes was enough to make him sick to his stomach. "Tomaz, your people will come for her, won't they? Isn't there some way to get her back?" "No!" the giant roared. He strode forward, pulled his sword from the tree trunk with wrenching, bone-breaking power, and swung it around in an enormous arc to sink it into the side of another tree, a tall redwood, where it stuck fast, quivering. He let go of the hilt and fell to his knees, covering his face with his hands. "Once she is in one of the capital cities, she will be disavowed," he said. "She will not be rescued. She will be mourned as if she were already dead, though she may cling to life for years to come." The prince stood stock still, unable to wrap his mind around what the man was saying. The girl had always seemed untouchable. No matter what danger had been thrown at her, she had dealt with it quickly and efficiently, following him undetected through Bainland, dispatching the Death Watchman in the Elmist Mountains. And she had rescued him. From the bowels of a seeker's lair, she had rescued him. He who wouldn't have lifted a finger to save her. "Now you are your own weapon. Now you have a choice." He spun to face the defenders. 5 of them, all told. 5. "What matters is what you use it for." The defender was watching Tomaz with evil glee.
"Yes, now you see. The Empire cannot be defied. Make your peace with whatever god you pray to, Exile, for there is nothing you can do to bring her back."
"Nothing he can do," the prince said softly, "but something I can do." The defender shifted his gaze to the prince, and his smile faltered and became uncertain. The prince reached beneath his drape-over, feeling the cold, wire-wrapped hilt of the dagger Leah had given him.
"What can you do?" the man sneered.
"I can kill you. Because what you don't know is that you're right. She is worth 10 of me, and she's also certainly worth 5 of you." The prince walked forward and slammed the dagger into his chest, piercing his heart. Immediately, the man's life was added onto the prince's. He staggered under the weight of the man's memories, even as he forced them to the far corner of his mind along with the bloodlust that came from the man's zealotry. His limbs flooded with strength, and the world leapt forward as his eyesight improved. The smell of the trees and grass and the stink of the defenders' bodies filled his nose. The sounds of skittering wildlife and calling birds suddenly seemed far too loud and close. The prince turned to the other 4 defenders. Without pausing to think, he stepped to each of them in turn and cut their throats. Their lives fell on him one by one. His heart began to beat so quickly and to pound so forcefully that he felt it might jump right out of his chest. He felt as though he could leap to the top of any of the tall trees surrounding them. He could see the veins of each individual leaf, hear insects buzzing and birds calling to each other what seemed like miles away. His blood was on fire with power and life. He had never absorbed so many lives at a single time. He reeled under the memories as they crowded against his own. Memories of hometowns, of childhood sweethearts, of murders and beatings they had committed in the name of the Empress. He focused on those, on their evil deeds, and used them to fuel his anger and his need to save the girl who had saved him. "What are you doing?" Tomaz asked. "Bringing her back," the prince said. He grabbed 2 swords from the dead defenders, one a long hand-and-a-half sword, the other a short stabbing sword. They felt no heavier than twigs. He reached out, questing for the life of the distant defenders and the exile girl. His mind, powered by the 5 deaths, shot out farther than it had ever gone. There was a woodsman several miles to the east. There were 2 women moving to the south. There were several small bands of what must be families off to the west in a little town. And there, a mile or more north, a band of soldiers and a girl, flashes of green and silver, the sound of steel cutting silk, moving steadily away. He set off at a run, his feet digging deep trenches into the soft ground as he shot through the forest with inhuman speed. Trees flashed by him to either side at an astounding rate. Each of his strides covered nearly 10 feet, his bounds leaving long gouges in the earth. He didn't know how long he ran for, following the life energy of the fleeing defenders, but as he ran the sun moved overhead, and he felt more than saw the forest take note of his passing. He was a phantom, a blurred wraith made of 6 men but controlled by the anger of 1. He ran faster and harder and longer than he ever had, dodging fallen trees, running up the side of hills, leaping streams, all with barely any effort. All while focused on that distant point of life in front of him, that single, beating heart that belonged to a girl with green eyes and raven hair. And finally, just as his stolen strength began to wane, he caught the scent of horses and the sweat of men in rusty armor. He pushed himself even harder, passing through the forest so quickly that he left whirlwinds of leaves swirling in his wake. Without warning, the forest ended, and he was running across a grassy plain that stretched out several hundred yards before ending in another line of trees. And silhouetted against that plain was his quarry. The squad of defenders rode in a tight knot, with Leah, bound and gagged, struggling and bucking wildly against her restraints, at its center. As he watched, one of the defenders turned to her and carelessly backhanded her across the face. The blow was so hard that it struck her temporarily still, and if it hadn't been for the ropes binding her to the saddle, she would have been sent tumbling to the ground. The prince growled deep in his chest, and the bloodlust of the defenders he had killed rose up inside him like a tide and swept him away before it. When he was 20 paces away, he hurled the hand-and-a-half sword toward the white-plumed helmet of the captain as if it were a javelin. The power of the throw sent the sword straight through the man's head, sliding neatly into the helmet up to the hilt, as if it were a hot knife sinking into butter. The prince felt his flagging strength and speed surge anew as the man's life was added onto his own. Memories flashed before his eyes, but he blocked them all out except for one: which men were where in the squad. He ran toward the left-hand column, which contained all 4 under-officers. The entire group was in sudden disarray, horses rearing in shock as their riders turned every which way to look for where the sword had come from. Leah, eyes wide and staring as the captain fell off his horse right in front of her, was in the right-hand column. A few men spotted the prince and notched arrows to bows, letting out cries of alarm. He watched them calmly, his mind moving at extraordinary speed, and as the arrows left their bows, he simply ran between them. And then he was among them, hacking and slashing and cutting with the short sword, twisting past their blades with the speed of a demon. He leapt from the ground onto the back of a horse, slit a defender's throat, pushed off the creature's back, flipped high in the air, and landed astride the horse of another under-officer. He pulled Leah's dagger from his belt, severed the man's spine, and then rolled to the ground and moved on. Soon the sword and dagger were both coated in scarlet blood, and with each kill he grew stronger and faster. He was invincible, a whirlwind of pure death, a tool of absolute and complete destruction. And then it was over. The horses cantered off out of sight, leaving the prince alone with 23 dead defenders lying on the ground around him. Leah had somehow managed to free herself from her bonds during the fight and roll to the edge of the battlefield. She was staring open-mouthed at him and the carnage he had wrought. He knelt amid the bleeding corpses, his eyes closed, his body shaking. Every muscle in his body jumped and rippled, bunched and released, only to tense again. His breath came in short, harsh gasps, rasping and tearing his throat, the smallest particles of dust in the air choking him. The scent of blood and death so strong that he could think of nothing else. He was on fire with life. It filled him so fully that he felt he must explode, that he must die at the very moment when he was filled with so much life that he felt like a beacon shining across the world for anyone who cared to see. The memories of all 28 men he had killed that day pounded inside his skull, overwhelming his mind, coursing through him as real as if he had lived them. Images of childhood, the sense of fresh baked bread and a father's hug, Hopes and dreams achieved and unfulfilled alike. Families, lack of families, lovers, friends, enemies, first kills, first loves, passion, hatred. Their fears, worst of all, always worst of all, buried so deep and left so long uncomforted that they were raw and bloody, brought out like a swarm of mutilated, deformed monsters from a dark cave ready to devour him whole. "Stop," he begged. "Please, stop. I don't want it. I don't want to care about you. I don't want to know you. Leave me alone. Leave me alone." His hands clutched convulsively at his head. He wasn't aware that he had spoken aloud, wasn't even sure who he was anymore. He was the defender Bolin who had joined up in Learn. He was Liam who had joined outside. Stop! He was Jamal who had 3 children and a 4th on the way. Stop it! He had no name to cling to, no identity. The Empress had taken it from him. He felt himself dying, submerged beneath all of the memories, all of the men he had killed. Strong, slender hands grasped his head, holding him as tears ran down his face. He was clutched against a lithe frame that smelled of the strong, earthy soap a giant named Tomaz made, and raven-black hair fell into his face, cool and feathery. "Breathe," a voice told him, a scared voice, but one with a thread of steely insistence in it that would not be denied. "Breathe. I'm here, Princeling. I'm here. Be here with me. Stay with me. Breathe." He did breathe then, a long, shuddering breath that burned his nostrils and lungs but helped to clear his mind. His own memories began to come back to him as the girl's insistent voice calmed his racing heart, her hands clutching him to her chest, holding him tightly. He took another breath, and the memories retreated further. Another breath, and his mind went completely blank, leaving him in silence. "You're okay," Leah said. "I have you. I have you." And the rest was darkness.